Good morning, everybody. This morning I'm going to do a little run on motor oil. You're probably going to be surprised at some of the stuff that you find out in here. Of course, you may be one of those people that already knows everything there is to know about motor oil. One of the things I used to find out when I was teaching was whenever I would have somebody in the class that thought they knew a lot more than they did. I had one boy that was 22 years old in there, and if I ever mentioned anything in the class that he hadn't experienced, he'd say, well, I don't know if I believe that because I've never seen it, and he was 22. Anyway, I'm going to have words spelling out on the screen because if you want to retain this information, you can basically look at these slides and reread them or whatever. But the American Petroleum Institute, it certifies oil meets original equipment manufacturer quality and performance standards, and that's really important, because there's a lot more to oil than just oil. And so, as engine technology changes, the oil has changed along with it. And everybody's seen this donut on the this particular thing here on the oil can and all that. But you got to kind of know how to read it. I'm going to pause right here for a second. Well, let me go on to the next slide. All right, so what you got here, and you can go by this, if you see a compression fired engine oil, it will be a C right here in this spot instead of an S. And the farther down the alphabet this particular letter is, the better the oil is. And then they've also got some other stuff like for power stroke diesels, you'll have anti-foaming additives in there, and they'll basically have classifications like CF4 and stuff like that on them. But spark-fired engines are going to start with an S. Now you can use, if you're just grabbing some oil for some engine that's not one of these really late model ones, if it's just kind of plain old engine, like I'd say like 2000 or 99 model or whatever, you grab a can of Shell Rotella or something and pour it in there, and you would be all right. Listen, I'm betraying my age. A can of oil, really? We haven't had oil cans in a long time. But anyway, so here we got a bottle of Shell Rotella or something. You could pour it in there if you needed some. You'd probably be okay with that because you're exceeding the specifications required for an engine like that. Now, when you get into these really newer engines, it's a different story, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. All right, you got to make sure you got the correct viscosity, whether it's full or synthetic blend. I use the Motorcraft synthetic blend, the orange jug, in my Fords, because that's what Ford calls for, and I like to use Motorcraft filters too. You got to have correct API and SAE ratings. What else we need to know is high mileage oil, incidentally, you might have seen that, has additives that soften the seals and mitigate leaks. Now, on one multi-viscosity 5W30 oil may be thicker or thinner than another 5W30, because now oils are miscible. That word is M-I-S-C-I-B-L-E, and that means that you're supposed to be able to mix them without causing a problem. So, if you were a quart low in your super duper whatever car, and all you could get was just a quart of plain old oil that you bought from the dollar store, you can pour that in there. You just don't need to be running, 5 or 8 or 10 quarts of that oil all the time. But if you have to add some, the wrong oil is better than no oil if you're in a bind and you got to have some. Smaller displacement engines, higher revs, increased temperatures, and there's gasoline direct injection. I'll talk a little more about that again in a minute, and why that would take another kind of oil. Better oil. Tighter tolerances. A lot of these engines now are built with the tolerances just about to aircraft specifications. Turbochargers are more significant than you think because they spend hundreds of thousands of RPM, whenever you're really getting on it on some cars. More exotic metallurgy. The metals are different than they used to be. Now, all this has got a lot to do with which oil you need to use, and the parts store catalog will tell you which oil is appropriate for a particular car. When in doubt, though, go with the OEM for that car, and the parts house will tell you that too. The parts house will typically say, well, this is the OEM for that, but this is the equivalent to it, etc. Not all oils are created equal, but you can analyze oil that's been drained from the same vehicle, and that's an important indicator of the wear that's happening in an engine. You can actually get like I'd say, you know, just try every other oil change, get one of these kits. So you can get a Napa oil analysis kit off eBay for $12.44, and you put the oil in there, send it off, you know, and you keep track of the reports that you get back on that, and you can get an idea of, you know, what's wearing out in the engine. And I can tell you what some of the parts are made of in a minute, and where that stuff comes from. But the different base stock is the oil that they start out with before they start putting the additives in it. There's different levels of additives, different manufacturing processes, and so how do these differences, you know, mean anything? Well, these metals show engine wear levels: aluminum, chromium, iron, copper, lead, and just down here, the molybdenum, boron, sodium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc. These are all additives. These are the things they put in the oil. One time, whenever I was in at Keller's flea market over there near Savannah with the boys, there was a guy that had some kind of Teflon oil additive that he was touting, and he had a little Iron Duke 4-cylinder GM engine, and he had it mounted on a stand with a radiator and all that, so he could start it up and run it. And he started that thing up, and while it was running, he took the drain plug out and drained the oil out of it. He then, while it was running, he took the oil pan off and the side cover, you know, where you can see the push rods moving and lifters and all, and he took the valve cover off. And that engine sat there and idled. Of course, it had a radiator and it had coolant going through it to keep it cool, but he let that thing sit there and idle all day long with no side cover, no oil pan, no valve cover, or rocker arm cover. And see, it was the Teflon additives in the oil was what he was selling. He had cans of this stuff he was selling, and that Teflon stuff's pretty good, you know. It does some pretty amazing things. However, it does coat the cylinder walls with some junk that's hard to get off of there when you're rebuilding the engine, but one way or another. But you see these worn out bearings. You know how anybody's ever done any engine work and know when you pull these bearings off and you're seeing this copper, then you got some issues with wear on that. Now, the lead is from bushings and rod bearings. Iron is from cylinder liners that actually rolled it over to the next line. Rings, crankshaft, camshaft, rods, valve train, oil pump, gear, wrist pins, cast iron components, and gear. Aluminum comes from pistons, main and rod bearings, pumps, you know, and it can come from the head, but they're not moving against anything there, you know, so you typically, this is the stuff that makes contact. Copper is usually soft metals present in main and rod bearing, oil cooler core, clutch plates, brass and bronze bushings, you know, so on and so forth. Of course, why do you have clutch plates in an engine? You don't. Basically, it's talking about something else. Hard metal is generated, chromium is a hard metal generated from piston rings, liners, exhaust valves, shaft plating. You know, a lot of exhaust valves are stainless steel, particularly in a turbocharged engine, where they used to be. Needle bearings, shafts, rod gears, stainless steel alloys, and tins usually in bearings, brass, rod. See, bearings have got several different types of metal in those. Nickel, you got nickel alloy valves, crankshafts, camshafts, bearings, and shafts, and that kind of thing. So anyway, you can save that slide if you want to. The additives are calcium, magnesium, sodium, detergent dispersant additives. You want it to keep the stuff suspended in the oil instead of it all settling to the bottom, right? And you want alkalinity because that's the opposite of acid. And like, you know, you think about your baking soda that you put on the battery whenever you're cleaning the battery acid off. Diesel fuel combustion got acid. I had read a long time ago there was this crazy oil filter system they were wanting to sell, and if you put the oil filter system on your car, it used rolls of toilet paper to filter the oil. That sounds ridiculous, I know. You might even be able to look that up. It was kind of pricey, and it was not easy to put on there. But what they were saying was that the oil, even after 10,000 miles, when you're using this filter system, was cleaner than the oil you poured in there. And it would neutralize all the acid and everything. So go figure. I'm not trying to sell this. I didn't buy one, but it was intriguing to me. But one of the things they were saying was 70 to 90% of engine wear is due to acid content in the oil. and a lot of it is sulfuric acid. So this alkalinity is really important to protect the engine. Sodium, calcium, and magnesium. Sodium helps disperse heat. You might think of how some valves have got sodium on the inside of them. All right. Zinc, phosphorus, and boron are anti-wear additives, and molybdenum is a friction modifier. Molybdenum, you might this moly grease. It's that real slippery black grease. That's molybdenum. And then your calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc, all that stuff is in there. What percentage of new oil is additives? Well, between 15 and 25% of it is additives. Viscosity improvers, the additives are the viscosity index improvers, dispersants to prevent sludge, pour point depressants, anti-foaming additives, detergents, and also there's a lot of different additives for different type engines and all, Rust and corrosion inhibitors, antioxidants, and anti-wear agents to reduce wear under heavy load at high temperatures, because basically you want the oil to be between the pieces of metal that are running next to each other whenever possible. Now, your piston rings, the oil rings act like a squeegee, and they squeegee the oil off so that they don't leave a bunch of it in the combustion chamber for the, to get slowly burned up, because that's where oil consumption comes. You can actually have good compression rings and good compression, but oil rings that are clogged up with sludge, so that it's not taking the oil off cylinder wall right. And you can have one that burns oil even though it's got really good compression and stuff. Antioxidants slow down the main cause of lubricant degradation in the engine. That's the breakdown of the base stock due to oxygen and heat. Oxidation of the base stock causes acid formation, which leads to corrosion and sludge and varnish, and that leads to blockages of oil flow. In recent years, like Dodge had some issues with sludging up, with engines, some of their engines sludging up, and whenever their engine was sludged up at the dealer, they would just replace the engine. They would not even clean the sludge out. Cleaning the sludge out is more labor time, and you're more likely to leave some of that stuff in there and have a problem. So rather than trying to get rid of this sludge, this is a Toyota engine here that had a faulty PCV system by design, and they replaced quite a few of these engines right around 99 or 2000 because of this sludge that built up in there, because the PCV system wasn't working right the way they designed it. So they had to change all that. But this sludge will block the oil. Furthermore, if somebody has made a lot of short trips, and I've talked about this before, this stuff will get caked up on the inside of the engine, and it will kind of stay there until some guy comes along and says, wow, this is cool, this is a mom and pop car that hasn't hardly ever been driven. And the first time they go on a long trip on it, all of this sludge begins to drain off of everything and get down to the bottom of the pan, and it clogs the screen. And I've known of this happening. Locks the engine up. And now back in the day, these old hot water V8 engines would do just fine with just about any oil you poured in them. There were some little rules, like if you were running non-detergent oil for a long time, and then all of a sudden you decided that you were going to run detergent oil, you would spring a bunch of oil leaks all of a sudden. So everybody that had any wisdom about them would say that. There used to be this bunch of hooey that's totally not true that bounced around this part of the country, and they would claim that Quaker State oil would sludge the engine up. That's not true. Quaker State oil is just as good as any other oil, as long as it's got the right classifications and all. But a lot of the people around here made a lot of frequent short trips, and they would use this Quaker State. They call it Quaker State Red Top because it had a red circle on the top of the can. And that was, you can't go around saying that Quaker State oil was the cause for that, because it had more to do with the way it was driven than anything to do with the oil. So you couldn't blame Quaker State oil, because there's nothing wrong with Quaker State oil, believe me. Viscosity is the oil's resistance to flow via gravity. So how fast will it pour out, like syrup? Higher the number, the greater resistance to flow. Ketchup would have a lower viscosity number, because you can pour ketchup. I'm going to pause to tell you a funny story. This lady that was in old ladies Sunday school class I taught said that when she worked at Dairy Queen over here, you didn't have an inside dining room in that Dairy Queen. It was just to drive up. Not drive through, you had to drive up, get out, walk up to the window and put in your order. And some doctor pulled in there on his white Cadillac that had a white interior with the top down. It was a convertible. And somebody pulled in there on another car and ran over a pack of ketchup. And that pack of ketchup sprayed ketchup all up in there, and it just speckled the inside of that guy's white Cadillac with ketchup. That was hilarious. But anyway, he was not happy. Multi-viscosity is the colder something is, the thicker it is. That's just the way things are. You know, like molasses in wintertime is real cold, real thick. Well, with a multi-weight, see, they said that weight word shouldn't even be there. Multi-viscosity oil, that thickness can be changed to vary with temperature, so it's not too thick when it's cold, and it's nice and thin when it's hot. 5W30 is as thin as a 5W oil when measured at negative 22, and as thick as a 30 weight oil, or a 30W oil. Winter is what it stands for. We get so caught up saying weight, because that's what everybody thinks that the W stands for. But again, it stands for winter and not weight. But it acts like a 30W oil whenever it's measured at 212. So that's, you got a 5W30, and that's what multi-viscosity is about. Now there's a hidden viscosity number that's not listed on the bottle because they don't see any point in it. They list the kinematic viscosity, but the other one is actually absolute viscosity. That's how much energy it takes to stir it. Now that's kind of important when the engine's spinning over on a cold day, because the crankshaft's having to stir that oil that's in the oil pan. So think about that for a minute. But they don't put that on the jug. All right. Oil life monitors. Now there's oil life monitors that are mileage based, and that's just basically an electronic oil change sticker. Then the ones that measure mileage and modify the warning trigger by time and temperature. Short trips that don't operate the engine long enough to evaporate moisture cause sludge, acid, and corrosion. So that was a little addendum I put there. Well, those other types of oil change reminders aren't trustworthy. The ones that are trustworthy are like the Ford 6.7 Power Stroke, some of the higher end luxury vehicles, and they use an oil quality sensor, which is different from the others. But whenever going by this, and I'm going to tell you in a few minutes why going by this maintenance reminder light on your dash is not a good idea on every car. Synthetic oil has got superior low temperature properties, better high temperature stability, lower volatility, longer oil life, responds better to additives. Also, the lower friction quality of synthetic oil gives you higher fuel economy compared to the same viscosity mineral oil. And so whenever you see one that requires synthetic oil, you need to use that. One example was this Chrysler Crossfire that we used to work on a lot that belonged to one of the instructors at the college, and it took 9 quarts of full synthetic oil. It was an expensive oil change, but she only had to have one every 10,000 miles. And see, if I put some other kind of oil in there other than what it calls for, and then she has an engine problem and comes back to me, she said, wait a minute, what kind of oil did you put in there? This one lady that was working at Montgomery Ward, who was a service advisor, said this guy brought her Mercedes in to get it, and apparently he had gone a long time without changing the oil, and so he decided he was going to clean that thing out. And so he poured a bunch of automatic transmission fluid in it, and he ran that. And whenever he pulled in there, he says he wanted that, drained out and the regular oil put back in there. Well, the engine failed, and he tried to blame it on Montgomery Ward, but she had made a notation on the ticket that he had filled it up with automatic transmission fluid and driven it before they ever changed the oil. And so he wound up, that was on him and not them because of that silly thing he did. He had an idea he'd clean it out, but the automatic transmission fluid didn't have the lubricant properties it needed, and it started an accelerated wear situation. Now, always err on the side of caution and be careful to use the right oil for the application. Going cheap is not good if it causes an engine failure. Of course, like I said before, other things can cause engine failures too, so be aware of that. And like, running the engine too cold and that kind of thing. And frequent short trips, etc. PCV system not working right. There's just, a myriad of things. All right, here's a little oil analysis story. This guy saw a video online about oil analysis, and he decided to give it a try. So he sent some of his oil to Blackstone. He noticed excess aluminum and didn't think too much of it. Later that year, he sent another sample, and it showed a lot more aluminum than the first time. Now, he wasn't having any symptoms. He wasn't hearing any engine noises. He didn't notice anything wrong. So he felt like as long as he wasn't, this is deceptive. I have had some people, when I would ask them, when's the last time you had an oil change? They says, well, it's been a long time, but the car still runs good. Think about that for a minute. Well, this is what he found out. He said, I took my vehicle to a repair shop and explained the situation to the service advisor. It turned out the timing chain guides were worn down. That's this plastic parts right here, and it started, the timing chain had started shaving away at this aluminum here because the guides were worn down. They'd worn through those guides, and it wasn't displaying any symptoms, and it wasn't making any noises, although a lot of the times they will. But just think about that for a minute. Things can be happening that you're not even noticing. Now, on my 2006 Explorer, I typically change the oil on that between 3,000 and 5,000, closer to 3,000 than 5, because I just don't trust higher oil change intervals. I would rather keep cleaner oil in there most all the time if I can. Film car trivia. Dukes of Hazzard went through 10 Dodge Chargers per episode, and they had 75 on hand they were constantly refurbishing. John Schneider, the guy that played Bo Duke, I heard him say that one time on an interview. The reason so many Chargers were used is the car always had to look good and be dent-free. Well, on Gone in 60 Seconds, they didn't care what the car looked like, but they only used one 73 Mustang to do that 45-minute car chase, and they destroyed a whole pile of cars. And anybody that's ever seen that 1974 Gone in 60 Seconds movie, that's probably one of the most famous car chases in American movie history. Mr. Majestic was a movie Charles Bronson made, and that was an old movie that came out in the 70s. And this Ford truck was not modified to do these stunts. It was just a truck that they bought, and the Ford Motor Company used clips from this movie in television commercials to demonstrate how tough their trucks were. And those trucks were doggone tough, I tell you that. Now look at this one here, just saying, I don't have any vendetta against Chevy, but look at this Chevy sagging in the middle. We had a GMC trainer vehicle, and I noticed when we jacked it up over there at the college, it would sag like this. And this tire store guy that I know, that I've known for a long time, somebody brought a Chevy truck in there with a utility bed on it that was loaded pretty heavy, and when he jacked it up, the frame broke in half, and so his insurance had to pay to get the frame replaced on that truck. But anyway, look, see this Ford over here is about the same year model as the one I have, and see how firmly it's holding its shape here. See, it's straight, and this one here is sagging. Some of the Chevy lovers will get after me about that and don't like it, but hey, I'm just saying, it's a real life observation. These two vehicles were in the same shop the same day. Believe it or not, it was the Nissan dealer, and I backed off and looked at that, and I says, wow, look at here. I could take both pictures at the same moment, and trucks were about the same year model. Oil can break down for a lot of reasons: diluted by fuel blow-by from overly rich mixtures, fuel from too long between oil changes, fuel due to frequent short trips, breakdown from the use of unauthorized oil additives, breakdown from driving like Steve McQueen. Also, if something like your fuel pressure regulator diaphragm ruptures and oil goes through the intake and you get a lot of oil in there, you get a lot of fuel in the oil, it'll do that too. There's weird stuff though, like these phantom engine ground issues that make micro arcs. You might remember the story I told you about the bearings that kept going out the back of the RX-7 because the ground wasn't hooked up to the engine good, and when you start it up, it would arc on those bearings. They kept failing over and over, and it turned out it was a bad engine ground that was causing the bearings in the rear end to fail. Well, it does the same kind of thing in the engine. It makes little micro arcs in there between the metal surfaces when you spin the starter if you have a bad ground. So just think about this. What's the starter making contact with? The starter is grounded to the engine block. The starter engages the flywheel. The flywheel is connected to the crankshaft. If the ground that's coming from the battery is not good enough at the block, like if there's paint in there between it or something like that, or it's a little bit loose, it's going to get a ground through the crankshaft. It's just wacky how that kind of thing happens, but electricity is always going to find the path of least resistance. Now this guy right here has a well-known, he's an engineer for General Motors, And I read this in an article he wrote. He said, I perform most all my warranty service, including oil changes on the vehicles in my household. I got a 2013 Malibu Eco hybrid start-stop, and it's now past the 100,000 mile mark. And so despite the highway miles, I should have changed the oil more often. And he said, my voice of common sense and technical reason said, don't dare follow that oil life monitor like an uninformed customer, but that's exactly what he did. So he followed it. He never let it go below 40%. And he was doing one of those 40% oil life remaining oil changes, and he noticed that he had driven 11,000 miles since the last oil change. And he says he went ahead and said, I lowered my head in professional shame and prayed for engine longevity grace. Well, he didn't get it. These lobes work the plunger on this high pressure pump, and they need some heavy duty lubrication. Using the wrong kind of oil is a nasty business when it wears these lobes, and the pump, to the point the camshaft and the pump both need to be replaced. See, those three lobes work that pump in and out, and it takes a lot of energy to do that. And so you got these metal surfaces. There's a lot of these cam followers have got rollers on them, but they can still wear out the same way. So the ticking started. Was a timing chain and a follower in a few places that ended up in the pan. And after that, the knocking started, crankshaft, main bearing knocking. And he said he would discover the GDI pump cam follower and the cam lobes were ruined. And he was hearing that, you can see how that's worn off and how that's worn off right there. That's just really ugly. So long and the short of it was, that's me holding a pump. You can see my thumb there. Anyway. So he used the wrong oil too. He had Mobil 1 on hand, what could go wrong? Well, it was ACEA instead of ILSAC GF5. The GM Dexos logo was nowhere to be found on the Mobil 1 jugs, and it was the wrong oil for his engine. Now this has been several years ago when this happened, so Mobil 1 was always up in their game, so you can't sit here and say Mobil 1 is something you should never use. Just make sure you pay attention no matter which oil you're buying. Don't assume just because you're paying the big bucks for synthetic oil that it's going to have everything you need, right? Here's a few good tips. Always use the right oil. Don't just pour anything in there. Don't trust the electronic oil change reminder. Always warm the engine up before shutting it off. Repair PO 125 and 128 code. That's usually a thermostat problem, so that the engine will run good and warm. Make sure it's running good and warm. It needs to be running about 200 degrees. Needle right up in the middle. That's really important. I will tell you this though, some engines last longer than others by default, even if you put the right oil in them. So, not every engine is created the same, just like not every oil is created the same. Well, I had posted a couple of pictures of this car when the front was jacked up a few days ago. Well, that was on May 1st that I noticed that it was still up and it had been there since April 24th. Well, that same car, he finished the brakes on the front apparently, and since April 24th, it's now the middle of May, and it's sitting there with the back end jacked up, and you can see some of the parts laying there. I would be spooked about leaving my jack sitting in the driveway. Now, I'm not passing judgment on this guy. He's probably got a lot on his plate, but leaving parts and tools laying around all over the place. See, somebody that wanted those wheels could just come carry them away. That worries me about this thing, I don't even know this guy, but it's just an interesting thing to watch from a distance, when you're driving by. Well, I'll see you guys next week. And hey, let's be careful out there.